what's up, guys? Good to see you again. Pray with me as we start our time today. Generous God, thank you for the gift of today. In abundance, you give us things both spiritual and physical. Help us to hold lightly the fading things of this earth and grasp tightly the lasting things of your kingdom. Refresh us. Invite us to discover your presence in each person that we meet and every event that we encounter. Teach us when to speak and when to listen, when to ponder and when to share. In moments of challenge and decision, attune our hearts to the whispering of your wisdom. As we undertake ordinary and unnoticed tasks, gift us with simple joy. When our day goes well, may we rejoice. When it grows difficult, surprise us with new possibilities. When life is overwhelming, call us to Sabbath moments to restore your peace and harmony. May our living today reveal your goodness. Amen. What we just did is a form of liturgical guided prayer. Liturgical acts are corporate forms of worship, meaning that more than one person engages in this practice at the same time. And it's meant to engage all of us as the body of Christ as a whole to participate in the life of God. And this is one part of a spiritual practice and discipline that we'll be talking about near the end of our time today. So I did a lesson a couple weeks ago called Missional Mindedness, and most of it revolved around bringing our attention to the living God and choosing to be aware of what's happening, what's going on around us, to re-enchant our faith. And so today I'm going to sort of expand on that topic and add some practicals to what we talked about a couple weeks ago so that we can, together re-enchant our faith. 500 years ago, life was very enchanted. God existed and the devil was real. The world teemed with angels and demons. There were magical creatures and there were dark forces, and that was a part of life. It was a world that had a very different worldview than we have now. Today, I would argue that we live in a very disenchanted world. With the Protestant Reformation and the beginning of the Enlightenment, the world, at least in the West, where we live, most of us live, has grown increasingly disenchanted. We live in a world dominated by science and technologies. Increasing numbers of us don't believe in God anymore. Actually, I was reading a statistic just 2 days ago about how the belief in God in the United States is at its lowest percentage that it's ever been. But, we say nothing about believing in the devil or angels or God. We don't expect miracles. We know that stage magicians aren't real sorcerers. There's a rational explanation behind their tricks and illusions. There's always an explanation. We've sort of grown up and left those fairy tales behind. And so rates of agnosticism and atheism in the United States have been steadily increasing, especially among the young and college educated. There's also the rise of what's called the nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who no longer formally identify with anything, any sort of religious tradition. Our public sphere is increasingly described as secular and post-Christian. Post-Christendom is sort of the age that we live in right now. So this rising tide of disenchantment has profoundly affected our spiritual and religious imaginations. We've lost our capacity for enchantment, or at least, the majority of us have. Our ability to see and experience God as a living, vital presence in our lives. So that's kind of where we're at, right? So when and where did that start? You'll see a picture here of Kahu'umukuakane. And I had the pleasure of interviewing this reverend this pastor, and he helps to pastor Kawaiihau Church. And in the interview, I meant to talk to him about the Native Hawaiians' relationship with Christianity and sort of what that was like. And I have a quote from him when we were talking, and he immediately just kind of asked me a series of questions, and he said, "Who is more spiritual, Nick? The person who believes in a singular God, or the person who believes that everything is God? This rock, God. That leaf, God. The wind, God. The smells around me, God." And this was all to sort of emphasize that civilizations of the past and people who have gone before us, they had a very different, they just thought differently. They saw things differently than we do today. Today, what we have is called our modern dogma. And I have a slide up here to show that. Dogma just means like a way of thinking. And this man that you see on the slide, his name is René Descartes. And he came up with a concept called the turn to self. So what is that? So before the Enlightenment, after the Reformation, Europe experienced 100 years of religious wars. Protestants were killing Catholics and vice versa. So, and both of them were killing Anabaptists, and Anabaptists are pacifists. So half the population of Europe dies, either directly because of war or as an indirect result of war, like disease, the Black Plague, pestilence, things like that. So think about half of all the population being gone. This creates a very big problem and a crisis for people like René Descartes. Descartes considers this problem, he diagnoses it, and he lays the problem at the feet of tradition, superstition, and kings, religion and government, which were one and the same back then, pretty much. And he wants to find a referee, an arbiter, who can settle problems between various claims that were causing all these issues, right? He didn't want to just appeal to a certain doctrine or a creed or a superstition, but something that everyone would accept. Therefore, it had to be grounded in something that couldn't be doubted, right? It had to be indubitable. And what he could not doubt was the fact that he doubted. And so he was a French philosopher, right? So he just had all these thoughts. But his famous saying was, "I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am." And so this phrase and this thought does two things. It's called the Cartesian turn to the subject. It's the I in personal pronoun, right? I am the arbiter of matters of truth. And it makes the interior of the individual now the final judge in matters of truth. And you judge through reason and logic. So whether it was through reason as it was for Descartes, or through a more experiential thing like it was for Kant, Immanuel Kant, and that's another thing that we don't have time to get into, he would say that the authority lies within the individual more than an entity like the church or even the government. And so this sort of thinking birthed what's called the scientific method. And if anyone is like a biology nerd or science nerd, you've heard of the scientific method. It's basically, this method is built on a series of doubts until you can get to something that you can verify as being true. And that's the process that all scientists take to sort of come to conclusions about things. It's all very rational and logical. And for Descartes, that rationality, it functions within the individual prior to anything else. And that trumps everything else. It trumps everything else. And it's aided by this critical theory called the scientific method. Hope you're with me. But it's both an elevation of the individual and of critical method. So that sort of thinking now permeates and forms the foundation of how we as Westerners think in general. We're extremely logical, we're very rational, and if you've been around in the church long enough, Western principles have found their way into even how we do Christianity today. Think about it. Most churches today try to appeal to the individual and how their individual needs can be met. When we study the Bible with people, to teach them about Jesus, we often appeal to logic and reason as the primary driving force to convince people about Jesus. And there's an author and minister, his name is Andrew Root, and he wrote in one of his works, I have the quote here, it says, "In the modern era, our attention has been drawn away from what our ancestors thought was obvious, that a personal God acts and moves in the world. Some would say this movement represents liberation. We've put aside an untenable belief, and instead what we've acquired is a unique observation blindness. It's not that we've given up an untenable belief, but that our secular age has drawn our attention away from divine action and toward something else. New forms of attention make us unable to see what was once obvious." And if some of that sounds familiar, a couple weeks ago I talked about this attentional blindness that we can have, basically an inability to see what's going on right around us because we have this tunnel vision and we do things sort of in a patternized way, and we lack awareness and we're not attending. So I think something that we can do, we can think religion is a matter of belief. But Root points out that there's something deeper and more fundamental going on. And he would say, and I would argue as well, that faith is a matter of perception rather than just belief. Faith isn't forcing yourself to believe in unbelievable things. Faith is overcoming attentional blindness. Phrased differently, faith is about enchantment, or rather maybe a re-enchantment, the intentional recovery of a holy capacity to see and experience God in the world. And without this ability, cultural disenchantment can erode our faith. Because disenchantment occurs in our life as we continue in attentional blindness. This concept of not being able to notice what's going on right in front of us, like we talked about. If you haven't watched it, I want to encourage you to watch it. But we watched this thing called the color changing card trick to sort of prove that it's very possible to be attentionally blind. And then we looked at the story of the Good Samaritan in the Bible as a scriptural example of attentional blindness. Another really good example of paying attention is really wonderfully illustrated in Genesis, in the story of Moses and the burning bush. After he flees from Egypt the first time as a younger man, we'll read this scripture in Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says, "Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, 'I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up.' When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, 'Moses, Moses!' And he said, 'Here I am.'" I must turn aside. That's the key point here. Encountering God's presence requires a shift of attention. Moses must intentionally redirect his attention to behold the strange sight. And we must as well, in the disenchanted and very skeptical age that we live in. God is here, God is there, but we're going to have to retrain ourselves to see. Enchantment starts with this willingness to see. As the Christian philosopher Simone Weil said, "Attention is the only faculty of the soul that gives access to God." Attention is the only faculty of the soul that gives access to God. Meaning God and accessing God is there. It just requires us being attentive. So I would argue that disenchantment, therefore, isn't about disbelief. Disenchantment is a failure to attend. And the eventual result and effect of disenchantment is a faith that is reduced to moral performance. Life with God is stripped of its inspired divine nature, and it becomes little more than following a set of rules. Faith becomes being a good neighbor, and I don't know, maybe just doing the right thing or being morally amicable. And the point of being a Christian becomes to just like be a good person. You know, I think if you want and desire that, and that's the only thing that you desire, you can go to a lot of other religions or faiths. You don't need God to be a moral person. I wouldn't say that. I would say that, you know, anyone can be a good person. You don't need God to just be a good person. You know, when Jesus came to this earth, he preached very radical things that cut to people's heart. And, you know, I look at him and I question, okay, if he just wanted us to be good people, is that something that he would die for? Like, would he just willingly die so that people could be reminded to be like a good person? I don't think so. And I think it requires deeper study of the Word for us to understand Christ's message, really what it means to follow him. So that's a disenchanted faith, right? So an enchanted faith is, by contrast, a wonder and joy-filled adventure with God. It's opening the wardrobe door and finding yourself in Narnia. And that sounds, as corny as that sounds, it's true, right? But this loops back to Moses' encounter with God, and it's exactly what it was. It was an encounter. Life with God is so much more than just knowing about God. It's more than just believing even in the God. The mystics didn't believe in God, they encountered God. The ancients who've gone before us, they didn't just believe in God, they encountered him. And I would just encourage you and remind you to remember that your life with God is not the sum of the number of spiritual books or resources that you've read, or how many scriptures you've memorized even, or how knowledgeable or well-versed you are, or if you have a doctorate in ministry. I mean, there were people in Jesus' time that held those honors, and they did all that stuff, and they were Pharisees. They're called Pharisees. These things mean absolutely nothing if we fail to pay attention to what God is up to. Yeah, and I would absolutely characterize the Pharisees among those who were disenchanted in their faith. But odds are, if you're struggling with disenchantment, you're either doing too much talking, too much thinking, or a combination of both rather than simply paying attention. The mystical tradition of Christianity has always known that the best way to encounter God is to stop talking and start looking. I have on the screen here, there's a guy, another picture of an ancient looking old guy, but there's a famous story about Thomas Aquinas, who is perhaps the greatest theologian of all time. But Thomas had spent most of his life writing and thinking about God. And toward the end of his life, he was working on his greatest work and book, and I don't know, whatever novel, but it's called the Summa Theologia. It's very complicated. Considered by many to be the most significant theological book ever written. But Thomas never finished it. On December 6th, 1273, while celebrating the Mass, Thomas had a mystical experience that caused him to stop writing the Summa. When his assistant urged him to continue and finish the book, Thomas answered, "I cannot, because all that I have written seems like straw to me." Whatever Thomas saw during Mass that day, whatever it was, it pushed his words, some of the most influential words about God ever written, past the breaking point. Because you see, when it comes to God, even words get left behind. I want to talk about something called living in a one-story universe. One of my professors, I'm in graduate school right now with our brother Brad Tamashiro, and one of our professors told us about his favorite work of art on the campus that he teaches at, and he's at Abilene Christian University in Texas. Some of you guys may have heard about it, but it's called Jacob's Dream, and I have the artwork or the sculpture here on the screen. It's by an artist named Jack Maxwell, and it depicts the story from Genesis 28. And this sculpture is set in a stone grotto, and the main part of it is depicting these 4 massive angels climbing a ladder to the heavens. And I want to read this story because I think it's super pertinent to what we're talking about. Genesis 28, starting in verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. So Jacob, in this story, he's on the run from his brother Esau, and he finds himself in the desert, out in the middle of nowhere. And when night comes, Jacob falls asleep and he has a dream. And in this dream, he has a vision of this ladder that reaches from heaven to earth with angels, going up and down. And he wakes up and he says, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. How awesome is this place? This is the house of God and the gate of heaven. And so he consecrates the place. He pours oil on the stone and he names a spot Bethel. And Bethel means the house of God. Recovering enchantment is learning to see the world like Jacob, where the gates of heaven can be anywhere. The gates of heaven could be anywhere, and it often shows up in unexpected places and in the middle of nowhere special. Like, listen to what David writes in Psalm chapter 5, verse 3. He says, In the morning, O Lord, you hear my voice. In the morning I lay my requests before you and wait in expectation. Our spiritual ancestors expected God. They expected him. They expected him to show up. And I think about them in comparison to how we can be. And I go, is that how I go about my day? Is that how you go about your day? Do you expect God to show up? And in a way, I think too many Christians are living like atheists, operating as if God doesn't exist. We don't expect to bump into God around the water cooler or when we're doing the dishes. I think we might believe intellectually in God, but we don't expect to encounter God. We're not going through the day with the eyes of Jacob on the lookout for the gateway to heaven. Christians can very much live like atheists. It's very much possible. And according to the Orthodox priest and author Stephen Freeman, he calls it living in a two-story universe. And in this two-story universe, the cosmos is a house built with 2 floors. As Freeman describes it, we live here on earth, the first floor, where things are simply things, and everything operates according to normal natural laws, while God lives in heaven, upstairs, and is largely removed from the story in which we live. To affect anything here, God must interrupt the laws of nature and perform a miracle. For us to see or hear from God, God has to come downstairs to visit us. But most of the time, it's just us alone on the first floor. God's absent. He's upstairs and he's minding his own business. When we live in a two-story world, we practice what Freeman calls Christian atheism. Since God is upstairs, God is not here, right? He's not close. God is elsewhere. He's far away. He's distant. And not just physically distant, like mentally and emotionally distant as well. God is sitting somewhere in the back of our minds, an afterthought if we think about God at all during our day. What we need to recover, according to Freeman, is a one-story vision of the universe. We need to see that God is, in the words of Freeman, quote, everywhere present and filling all things. In a one-story view of the universe, God and humanity are all living on the same floor. We're roommates with God, and we expect to see each other all the time. And as Jacob declared, we're living in this house of God, this one-story universe. There's a term for seeing the world like this one-story universe way, and it's called having a sacramental ontology. So a sacramental ontology, that's just a fancy way of saying that we live in a one-story universe. Ontology, that word, is concerned with existence and our thoughts about reality. Sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible reality. So putting these two words together, sacramental ontology, it's basically saying that everything around us, everything that has ever existed, it all points us toward God. Everything points to God. God is everywhere, filling all things. Gerard Manley Hopkins, a poet and a Jesuit priest, wrote, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. God's vitality and life crackles through nature like spiritual electricity. The sunlight, the wind, and the rain are not just signs pointing us to the Creator. God is really present in nature." So it's more than just signs, it's God Himself. God is embracing us in the sunlight that hits our face, the raindrops that fall on our skin, and the breeze that ruffles our hair. God comes to us in people as well. Hopkins wrote in a different poem, "Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not His." God is really present in the faces and hands of other human beings as we fellowship, have relationships, and love one another. And there's a wonderful example, I couldn't find the word. There's a wonderful example of sacramental ontology in Acts chapter 14. This was the first sermon recorded that was preached to an entirely pagan audience. In the first 13 chapters of Acts that recounts the growth and the missionary efforts of the early church, the sermons sound very much the same. You can read them all. They all talk about this history of the Jewish people leading up to Jesus. They were delivered to fellow Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. So the gospel preachers, they could rely on a shared history with their audience. Their common history with the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But in Acts 14, Paul and Barnabas, traveling through the cities around the Mediterranean Sea, they've been rejected at Jewish synagogues. And so they turn their attention to the Gentiles of the city, this pagan audience. And so in Acts 14, you see Paul, he heals a crippled man, and a crowd gathers, right? And so he does what's natural to him, and he delivers a sermon. He starts preaching. But no one in Paul's audience that day knew anything about the plagues or the Ten Commandments. There was a lack of shared religious history with his listeners, which created a problem and a challenge. How do you introduce and describe God to a people who have never seen or heard of him before? And here's what he says. He says, "Friends, we bring you good news, that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to follow their own ways, yet he has not left himself without a witness in doing good, giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, and filling you with food and your hearts with joy." So, unable to appeal to Abraham or Moses, Paul turns the attention of his audience to the natural world, right? The natural world. God is everywhere present. And in this one-story world, Paul says that God hasn't left himself without a witness. We witness him everywhere, in everything. God's voice is heard in the rain and in the fruitful seasons. God is close where there is even good food and good company and fellowship and the laughter of and the company of good friends. He says God has been with you the entire time, filling your hearts with joy. I want us to remember the one who brings us joy, to remember the source of that joy, to remember who is in control of the rain, who knows each star, and to redevelop just our sensitivity to the wonders and the sacraments that are all around us. Because you are standing at the gateway to heaven, and you are living in the house of God. And so this enchanted Christianity, what is it? I think we got to remember, faith is concerned with seeing what is already there, turning aside, looking past distractions, and recovering a sacramental ontology of the world. All of that invokes an enchanted faith. And like I said, in essence, it's a matter of paying attention. So for the rest of our time, I'm going to turn us to some enchanted Christian traditions and practices, because there are many to survey and there are many to follow. There's no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to enchantment. We don't have to start from scratch. There are many before us who lived very enchanted spiritual lives. Nicholas Herman, he was a Carmelite friar in the 17th century. He wrote a work called Practicing the Presence of God. And I just, that title in and of itself explains what he's getting across. The spiritual life consists of doing exactly what you're already doing, your daily work, your regular routine, from your work commute to washing laundry to dealing with customers at your workplace, but doing it all with an awareness and presence of God's love. Work and prayer are not two distinct activities. And Nicholas said, the time of business does not, with me, differ from the time of prayer. Practicing the presence of God. It's a discipline. It's a spiritual discipline. But it's about the life of God just kind of permeating every other part of who we are. One time I criticized Shelly, my wife, for not praying for her food before she ate. And this was years ago. And I sort of turned to her because I thought we were going to pray for the food. And I was like, why didn't you pray for the food? What's going on? And she turns and looks at me and kind of gives me this look. And in a little bit of a snarky way, she simply responded, "My life is a prayer." And I didn't quite get it at first. And this was years ago, but I think I sort of understand it now. But it's just kind of like what we just read, like our life is a prayer. And so I want to talk through some of these spiritual disciplines that can bring our awareness to God, to the presence of God, because it doesn't emerge out of thin air. Awareness of God and being mindful is a effortful and practiced spiritual discipline. And so, we want to practice the presence of God. Both enchantment and disenchantment are habits of attention or inattention, awareness or obliviousness. So these spiritual disciplines and exercises, I'm going to just briefly explain, serve to cultivate that awareness, openness, and receptivity towards God. And for a good part of last year and this year, I've been practicing these spiritual disciplines in my life. The first one is morning and evening prayer. So we're going to have a QR code up here on the slide that you can, scan with your phone, and we'll have all the documents there that kind of go more into depth than what I'm going to explain today. But morning and evening liturgical prayer, we did the morning prayer at the very beginning, right? But it's a guided meditative prayer. I introduced this to our teens and our Ohana group, late last year. But it's this thing where we collectively pray this prayer together in the morning. Well, individually, but together, separately. We'd pray this prayer and a different prayer in the evening with the focus of drawing our attention to God. And we'd pray these prayers with open hands, inviting God to our day at the start of it and inviting God as we end our day in contemplation. And there's power in collective prayer. There's power in corporate prayer. And it's supposed to be done together. But it's a cool feeling knowing that brothers and sisters are praying the same prayer with you. So there's the first one. The second one, and again, I don't have time to do in-depth things with all of these spiritual disciplines. So I just want to encourage you to read them on your own. The second one is the breath prayer. So this is a practice that utilizes short phrases that are said in rhythm with our breathing. It's a form of spiritual meditation. My professor taught us that as we inhale, we would say a phrase. For me, as an example, I would say, God of justice, as I inhale, God of justice. And as I exhaled, I would say, fill me with compassion. And you would rhythmically repeat this prayer. I'd utilize this prayer on prayer walks. I'd go around my little condo neighborhood in the loop that we live in, breathing in and out, and I would just, God of justice, fill me with compassion. And this meditative prayer centers ourselves and turns us aside to notice God. And the goal of it is to open up and create space for God that we can inhabit ourselves. And, I would encourage us to try this, to find words and scriptures, to craft prayers and exercise them until the words, the goal would be, become automatic and habitual, like breathing itself. And the last spiritual exercise I will show us is called the prayer of the examen. And this was a spiritual discipline that was created by Ignatius of Loyola, and he founded the Jesuits. But this is another guided meditative prayer that has 5 movements: thanksgiving, grace, a review of the day, forgiveness, and invitation. And I know a lot of this may be new to us who have maybe been part of the church for a while. Meditative prayer, guided prayer is not something that we normally practice. And we go, what kind of tradition? What kind of weird thing is this? But, when Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he taught them to pray, the prayer that we all know and love. And he taught them. It was a guided prayer. So, I want us to just be open to new ways to seeking God and practicing the presence of God. But each of these movements help to bring mindfulness and awareness to our day specifically. It's like a recap of our day. So it's normally practiced in the evening. It takes about a 10 to 15 minute exercise. And I want to encourage you guys to try it. So out of these 3 practices, I encourage you to try one, maybe all 3. But practice the presence of God this week. So I hope today was informative, educational, and practical. Turning our attention to God invites us to a new breadth and span of God, and in a place that it's spacious and expansive. So rather than limiting God and ourselves to a singular dimension of spirituality, we can learn to really create space for the God who is alive, moving, and active in his creation. So ultimately, this thought of enchantment and spiritual disciplines, what they do is they get us out of this realm of control. Christianity moves away from managing and controlling outcomes, this kind of business-like mentality, and moves us toward what I think is what we all desire in the first place, the simple pursuit of the heart of God. It moves us just to simply pursuing and seeking God. We choose and we seek to align our heart with God. And that, the alignment of our heart with God, that's the oil, that's the lifeblood, that's the driving force, that's the spirit-filled energy that not only sustains our faith, but can categorically move it into places that we've never experienced before. So as we close, I want to practice the night prayer, the evening prayer with us as we close. So pray with me. And again, this is supposed to be done at night, but for example's sake, we're going to do it together. Lord, it is night. The night is for stillness. Let us be still in the presence of God. It is night after a long day. What has been done has been done. What has not been done has not been done. Let it be. The night is dark. Let our fears of the darkness of the world and of our own lives rest in you. The night is quiet. Let the quietness of your peace enfold us, all dear to us, and all who have no peace. The night heralds the dawn. Let us look expectantly to a new day, new joys, new possibilities. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks, guys. See you later.
Before you go, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can also follow us on social media and find the link to our connection card down in the description below. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye!